Welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. In this adventure, Steve and I dive into the depths of the difficult mystery of death. And through the framing of this, we find many areas to explore and map. The recursive patterns of reality and its relation to the self are explored from several angles, and our personal journeys with Dialogos become known. I hope that you may find this helpful and would like to emphasize a point made late in the conversation. One does not need to be well read or conceptually sophisticated to be all that they are. One simply needs to be. Thank you, and as always, if you enjoy the content, like and subscribe.
How you set it up last time. Like, I really want to get into this, and yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of interesting. I don't know, like one of the things that I've been trying to notice and work on is learning how to transition conversations and like pause a thought and be able to come back to it, because I have a hard time with that.
Yeah, it was funny. I was noticing even like for myself when I think I went to say something about the magicians or whatever last time, and then I had to like start over again, and being false for just that like 3 seconds, like it took me like 2 or 3 tries just because I'm not used to that.
I think there's a way in which it actually, like, it really limits my interaction capabilities with people, because I tend to be so much of a, like, I can see connections that are fairly tenuous, and then I'll just go on them, and then I lose people, and then I can't come back to where I lost them. So
yeah, the tangents, that's always the hard part. I think even last time you set it up, you were like, you wanted to talk about the afterlife, and like when you die, there's something about that you struggled with in the Christian frame of like hell and heaven, and then we just jumped somewhere else because of that break. But if that break hadn't happened, we would have been on that topic. So
yeah, that might be an interesting one to talk about. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah,
because I had a couple topics that I had put down to maybe talk with all three of us, but since Shane can't join us, so just kind of, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So how do you conceive of like the heaven and hell idea, and maybe like when you were younger, how did it feel to you, and then kind of now, how do you relate to those ideas?
When I was younger, I really struggled with that. I think, at some point I was convincing myself to be Christian at like a Pascal's wager level of just like, that's where my friends are going to be, I want to, pretty much. But I did really struggle with why. And then also I knew that you adapt to pain, and so the idea of that eternal hell just didn't make much sense as it was described to me. So I just kind of like, how important it was impressed on me and how little sense it made was always a sore point for me, for sure. When I look at it now, though, I think there's like the materialist frame that I can put on things, that like I can describe it that way. And then there's the frame of stepping past that to what I think is more recently in the last couple of years that I've opened up to. So on just the material level there, like just what I think is guaranteed, and I think as you die, you have these experiences of looking back over your life and kind of evaluating yourself, standing in judgment of what you should have done that whole time. So it's kind of, if you lived your life unconsciously, or, well, you realize it in the last moment, assuming you die in a way that allows for that. And, it's hard to imagine something more painful than as you're dying, wishing everything had gone differently. So I think that's where you get the idea of hell from. Getting into the more like spiritual realm and like the transition of what happens after death, I think there you're in a space of when, because I do think the ego dies when you die, right? I don't think that it continues. So I think if you're identified with the ego as you're dying, it feels like hell, because you're collapsing into nothing for real, which you've always worried would happen, right? But if you're not identified with the ego, it can feel very expansive and almost like beautiful, because the anchor is dropping, not you.
Totally.
So yeah.
Totally. Yeah. That maps very well with kind of the direction that I take it now. Um, I think from the materialist frame, I I take it from I'm almost like an evolutionary in terms of how it developed in the human consciousness.
Mm,
That there's this, the hell is some kind of amalgam of all the worst states of being, essentially, right?
yes.
And like most things that are amalgams of symbolization of the worst things, it's placed in the worst language you can imagine, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I think the reason that the symbolism is what it is because there has to be something that's as bad as everything could possibly ever get.
You need the
And
opposite of God, the opposite of heaven, right?
yeah, and like, I mean, there's nothing worse than as bad of torment as the most sadistic version of yourself can come up with that never ends.
Mm.
Like that's the fullness of bad in the human condition. Right? So I think that's where the symbolism comes from. And then in terms of, I don't know, yeah, I think that makes sense. I think there's some kind of I've been there when a lot of people have died, and I've had a lot of conversations
Mm.
with people. I mean, this is one of the main reasons I actually do my job. Uh,
Oh, interesting.
is that I didn't. So this is a bit of a tangent. So if we can, I'll come back to the hell aspect here. But as an aspect of my personal story, like I found myself doing medicine. Um, is is the right way to say it, and
Mm.
I found it in I worked as a tech in an emergency department, and part of that role was I would do CPR when people were coding, which
Right.
is the word for dying.
Yeah.
And um, there was a night where I had already worked a 12-hour shift and I was staying overtime, and it was about 2 in the morning, and there was a SIDS case which came in. SIDS stands for sudden infant death syndrome, and it was this like beautiful like 9-month-old baby boy, and we worked on him for probably 2 hours, and couldn't get him back. And there's a sound that a mother makes in that situation when especially when she realizes that her baby's not coming back. That is, it's one of those things that it is almost, from my perspective, it's like one of the ultimate things to experience in terms of just acute suffering and agony. Um, and so I walked out of that room, and I went to sit on interestingly enough, a mental health hold where I was the one-to-one person, and I just sit there with the computer. So I started writing, and just like, what am I doing here? Why do I do this?
Mm.
And I discovered that the reason I did it was that there was something about the transition that happens when in the death experience and in the suffering experience and the fear surrounding death, that is the space in which um, I found meaning. That was the most meaningful thing that I had
Mm.
found to do.
To help
Um,
people in that space.
yeah, yeah, to be there. Initially, I formed that as something of like try to save people, but
Mm.
I always had a sense that that wasn't enough. That it
Mm.
wasn't really about saving people's physical lives as much as it was about being with people when they're in some kind of existential state of suffering and fear, because ultimately everyone passes away. So anyway, um, yeah, that was a huge part of my story, and now I find myself finding the most meaning in my job, having conversations with people that are, hey, you're moving toward the end of your life. What do you want that to look like? And that goes everywhere from, you know, you may not have any more than a couple of weeks to, this is the start of a downward slope. So
Mm.
I've seen a vast range of how people approach death. there's definitely those people who are very at peace. They're very open to
Mm.
it. They're yeah, they're almost at one with it, which is an it those conversations and those experiences are so deeply meaningful,
Mm.
because there's something that is so pure about a life that, whether it was well lived or not, um, those parts that were not have been forgiven.
Mhm.
And so, in your frame there, which I think is a very good one, about you at that point, you're almost seeing, taking stock of, interacting with all those past, maybe the version of you that could have been.
Mm.
And it seems that there's a really significant difference between the people who have forgiven themselves or repented, or whatever word you want to use there, for the
Mm.
idea of having integrated something and made restitution, maybe, or whatever. Um, and it is something like hell, like, because the people who are wanting to hang on to life no matter what the cost,
Mm.
and are struggling, and it can be a really heavy and devastating experience.
Yeah, and for those around them as well, I imagine it's harder when the person's clawing at the gate, you know.
Yeah.
That's a very heavy job you got there, man. That, I mean, great for growth and for getting you in a space to see these things. I've never been around death really. My grandfather passed away, and that was, you know, very personal, of course, very challenging. But I think that's really the only exposure I've had. So that's really interesting to hear your perspective. What is it that helps people in that state, and what is it that just, you know, does your job prepare you for that, or how much spirituality is really kicking through there in those moments?
um they were in PA school, so I work as a physician assistant, so I have a master's degree, so sorry, excuse me. um it's kind of a an abbreviated version of medical school, and then you're something like an abbreviated doctor.
Mm.
It's a very rough sketch and might hurt some people's feelings whose egos are involved. So I don't mean that in any negative way. Um, but there was some helpful training in there. It wasn't really
Mm.
spiritual. You don't. There's not too much opportunity for that in the medical community
Mm.
training situation. But I think, it gave you some basic tools. And but the way that I've found that I interact with people the most in that is, and that's the most helpful, is just being there with them. It's not so much uh, what I say exactly, although I mean I'm sure the experiences that I've had and the kind of frame I hold around it helps me to not say things that are maybe not that are maybe unhelpful. But it's mostly the way in which I'm present.
Right. You allow them to have that intensity of emotion. So, this gets into a little bit of what we were talking about, I think, through text there, but um, where who you are is in some part in relation to who the other person you're with allows you to be. And kind of what we're trying to foster here is that dialogos, where we're seeing each other as the best possible version of each other and allowing that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So in that's what you mean in that sense. You're there with them and let them fully be where they actually are, rather than having to mask up for you because you're a medical professional or something like that, right?
Yeah. And even from themselves, because one of the things that this is more, I guess, personal for me, but where I always find that when I stop fighting against the thing that I'm afraid of, or dreading, or suffering because of, and just
Mm.
allow myself to be with it, it changes a lot and allows me to transcend that suffering in a lot of ways. But
Mm.
it can be difficult for me to get to that place by myself. Whereas if I'm with someone, my wife is very good at this. just who kind of creates a space for me to be with the thing, um, and acknowledges the thing, right? Because that's one of the big things that I'll often do is, hey, I do think you're coming to the end of your life here,
Yeah.
and then just not run away from it, because it's always the I need to run away from that. And then I think when there's a person there who's fully aware of the thing and taking it seriously in the way that you are, but they can just hold the space for the thing, and it allows you to do the same.
Yeah, because you almost imply how they should react to what you're saying by how you're saying it. And if you're like hesitant with them or you don't know how to break the news, that can make them react more resistantly, right? Whereas if you're plainly acknowledging it and saying, this is a situation that's, I don't want to say easier to swallow, but maybe a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I think people have a sense of that. That's kind of the point at which you stop playing tricks with yourself.
Mhm.
And so I think they really appreciate when the person who's engaged with them in taking them over that threshold conceptually
Yeah.
doesn't try to play tricks with themselves, because that's always the fear, and that's one of the things that I have to deal with every time still, is to acknowledge my own uh, aversions, right? My own sense of I don't want to be in this situation. I'm uncomfortable. I have
Mm.
to allow for those things in my own space first, and then I can proceed into it and hopefully hold some space that they can be in.
Mm. Medical practice is such a spiritual field. Like in ancient cultures, it would have been priests, doing this stuff. So
Yeah,
I think those people are very lucky to have you. You help them with that journey. That's a very hard thing.
I hope so. I'm I've found it deeply affording to me in so many ways. Um, I I owe my patients so much,
Hmm.
um, for allowing me. It's amazing how much I will open doors that I don't think many people open in the clinical setting. I'm sure some do, but
Hmm.
because of the issues around religion and spirituality and polarization of things, I think even those who maybe would have in the past for whatever reason wouldn't feel comfortable now. But people allow me to open spaces and are open with me and kind about it. It's yeah, I'm super fortunate for that.
That's awesome.
But anyway, so let's go all the way back if we
Bring
if
that
we
back to hell.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I like your frame a lot of that sense of seeing your past self, um,
Mm.
as being the end of the material in that sense. But then I think in going into the spiritual and the metaphysical,
Mm.
I very recently began to move outside of a place where either I did not have a great answer for, slash didn't couldn't really perceive for myself how much of an ontological reality hell was. Um,
Mm.
and to some degree, then just spent a lot of time not paying too much attention. Um, because although ultimately I probably would have said, yeah, I believe in it, I very much didn't want to. And certainly if I did, I didn't want to hold any sense of like what it looked like for sure.
Right. So it was maybe part of Christianity that you resisted most. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think now I understand why. Because what and this is from David Bentley Hart, but reading his book helped me to kind of start to get a grasp on this realization that you can't have an ontological reality that stands at the same level of ontology as God and is separate in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And you also can't have the transcendental attributes of God held in the manner which they are and hold to an ontological level of reality that coexists at that level, right? Because at that level you have differentiation.
Mhm.
And so it's just, it doesn't work metaphysically. It really doesn't work.
Not if you understand what God is and oneness ultimately, right? Because if you have this conception of God as another person, it's easy to add his enemy, like the villain. And if it's Zeus and it's Hades or whatever, then you can get there. But yeah, at the level at which you're talking about, where God is what created the universe, the force that exists before space, then it's really just a matter of, if you understand it, then it can't be the case. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it was kind of so this was a huge linchpin for me. And this was really pretty recent in terms of a sense of things coming together in a way that allowed me to be much less caught. Because the fear of hell was something that would catch me a lot. And, it'd catch me and make me try to hold some knowledge of good and evil, really. Which is maybe the ontological reality of hell. I mean, technically it is, right? From your definition of saying it's the death of the ego.
The death of the ego while you're attached to it. Yeah.
Right. Or yeah, but at least the physical death is the transition out away from.
Yes. Yeah.
At
that point, it basically inverts, and it's hell that you're leaving when you die, in a sense, really, at least the possibility for it. So,
which like the hell symbolism and the hell reality works all the way to that level. And that's one of the things that's so cool about it for me now, is like, it's not like I believe in hell any less. I actually believe in it more. I just realized that there's another layer beyond that, at which hell isn't ultimately real. But once I've committed the knowledge of good and evil, like, hell goes with me every layer all the way from there.
Yeah. I don't want to do too much of an aside here, but this is actually an interesting reason why I struggle with concepts of reincarnation. Okay. And I don't think that they're particularly valid, because, again, I think the ego does actually die at the end of your life. And so, people usually talk about coming back and learning things and karma and these kind of things. And I think that what happens when we die is the fragment returns to the whole. And another fragment can come down, but it's all one ultimately. So I don't really have this continuation of the fragment. I think the whole game is realizing that that's not what continues. That what we really are underneath that is what continues. So it's interesting to me to see that, in the Buddhist tradition, there's these really profound realizations. Then there's whole other schools of it that seem to be unaware of those deep realizations, at least as I interpret them, which is my own self-learning, so I could be misinterpreting it.
Yeah. My understanding of Buddhism is fairly. It's not well sourced. So I seem to be able to see the picture quite well, but I'm sure there's strange aspects of it. But yeah, I came to this kind of perspective not too long ago, probably as in a lot of ways as a function of some of the conversations that we've had, because I think a lot of the language that you use with quantum and the space and time metaphor and those things, but they helped me to kind of get to that place where I could actually feel that sense and see it. Cool. But I'd been paying attention to the reincarnation thing quite a bit just before that. And so getting that sense of, okay, well, the true self that is underneath all the individuation does continue. But at that point, it becomes non-individuated. So yes. It does come back, right? There's this sense in which I have lived my life, your life, and every single life that ever will be lived. I mean, we all experience all lives that are lived. And this is like this wasn't too hard of a concept for me to grasp, actually, from the Christian frame, with the ideas of kind of, you know, what's done in secret is shouted from the rooftops, and you know, the final judgment, and kind of just the complete knowledge of all things, right? All things that are ever done in your own personal life. And I think that works perfectly.
Yeah, I think it's almost like what hell is getting to the end of your life and realizing that you could have been God the whole time, and instead you chose to be you, and realizing the significance of that choice when it's too late, and and really getting to the place where you're willing to die because you realize that God, that the true nature of the universe enacted through you, is better for you too, and for everyone else, of course, massively. And so, yeah, it's essentially like the willingness to die in order to be what you really are, which is God. And if you didn't, you can get to the end of your life and realize you didn't play the game. And that's hell.
Yeah, exactly. And this is how the only way to not die is to die before you die.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually love that. And like a lot of philosophers basically say that philosophy is just preparation for death, just getting you ready for it, because you're alive, and you're basically, that means that you're falling towards the death of your body, at least. Right?
Yeah, totally. I'm using kind of this picture that we've built here. Like this is the Christ story. Is, the fall traps the awareness into its individuated forms, in a space that they cannot access. They are no longer, like, there are flashes that may be seen, but they cannot access the whole. And they can no longer, come back to that space of their own accord. They're lost, right?
Yes.
And the incarnation is the actual binding of the entire unity of the one, of the infinite, back into itself.
Mm-hmm.
It is the recursive, like, this is why the Christians are right about the incarnation being the center of everything, is because the incarnation and then the death is the point at which the human consciousness recursively unites.
Yes.
Like, and it took and it has to be the ultimate story. It has to be the ultimate paradox. And this is why Christ on the cross says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because God has to forsake himself.
Yes.
And like,
that's the process of fragmentation.
Yeah.
God becoming from unity to fragmentation, he has to separate from himself. And that can be thought of as the self, imposing attention upon awareness and limiting our view.
Yeah. And this is why, with the resurrection of Christ, Paul can say over and over, all over in the New Testament, that, through Christ is all creation redeemed. It's so crazy. Like, David Bentley Hart's book, I don't know if you've ever read it. The name is escaping me. It has to do with it's this whole argument about how hell cannot be ultimately real, and for universal salvation. Oh, that all shall be saved. That's the name of it. But
I'll pick up on that, but go ahead.
He talks about how, if you can actually take the lenses of that hell is real off, which is really, really hard to do if you're a Christian. Like, it's really hard. It was really hard for me.
It's like the main point they hammer home some traditions.
Yeah. Like, it was really difficult for me to actually not even to disbelieve it, but just to like peek beside it, to actually like to actually pay attention to the argument and be in dialogos with him in that book. And once I did that, I started looking and like looking up these verses that he's citing, because he's like, hey, there's really only a few places that even possibly refer to anything like the modern idea of hell, because the
Mhm.
Greek words just there's not.
Dan- Dante's Inferno mostly is the common conception.
Yeah, and like once you take that away, you have only a few verses, and then you take all the verses that seem to very transparently, maybe not totally transparently, but if you have those glasses off, they certainly imply salvation of all things.
Mm.
And you stack those up against each other, it's not a close fight.
Sorry, stack what up against each other? I just lost that part of it.
Oh, if you stack up like the scriptural evidence, right, of,
Yeah,
hey, how is everybody going to be saved or are they not? And it's like,
right. And what's so interesting is that, like, I'm taking your word for that with your knowledge of the Bible there, but the common presentation of it is certainly the opposite, in the sense that, like, the most real thing is hell. That's why you should believe any of this. That's why you should even come to church. Like, it. If your number one selling thing you've got wrong, then that's the hole to dig out of. Anyway.
yeah, yeah. So you wanted to jump off at that all shall be saved point.
Yeah, because that's something I really struggled with, like the whole idea that, like, everyone has to be saved in their lifetime now, like everyone has to awaken, and I have to dedicate some portion of my life to making sure that that happens. And that was me trying to, that's the spiritual ego trying to save people and stuff. um, but and really, because in the end everyone does return to God in that sense. I mean, the egos don't, but there's only one being playing the game, and the body dies, and we all go to the same place and become the same thing, regardless of how you live. So the redemption's built in, its ultimate is guaranteed. Um, Maybe not on the thing that you think you are, but that's your trick.
Yeah. What you think you are is not safe.
Yeah, well, and in fact, it doesn't even persist from moment to moment. It just seems to. But
Yeah.
that's a hard one. um, so let's get into the afterlife then, in terms of. Well, let me say one thing quickly. The other version of hell that you can go through as you try and kill your ego and go through the spiritual journey, right? That's what we've talked about before: going through your traumas, processing subconscious and unconscious, and becoming whole. And for me, I love the term lake of fire. I connect to that. I tweet about it fairly often, because to me, it's I had a lot of back pain and stuff like that. And I think of pain as fire, and it's this like lake of fire. And you actually do have to walk through it and come out the other side. So, like, that's the resurrection story for me, is Jesus losing his ego through acknowledging all of the things, all the ways in which he was not true to God, true to nature, processing reality as it really was happening. And that is hell in a sense, because it's terrible to go through, but it is, that is what redeems you, that pain. So to me, that's a very uplifting view of hell, even though it represents some of the worst moments of my life, of just the intensity of emotions that I was going through, to go through that lake of fire. But I try and encourage people to just go in, like, that's your subconscious, your unconscious. You got to go there. You got to swim in the fire to get to the good Greenland.
Man, that's beautiful. That's beautiful, because I think you actually just used modern secular language to paint the actual full down and up trajectory of the human perspective on hell.
Mm.
Because I mean, or the Christian perspective, because as you go down, and you get to the worst places, and you think about it being material and all these things, as you go on your own personal hero's journey, the first steps towards coming out of it are the realization that somehow there is some kind of balance that has to be worked out, right? And then you move to the space where you start to realize that, well, this whole symbolism thing, whatever it is about hell, has to do with the actual working out of that stuff.
Mm.
you know, and then you get to these ideas of the burning of the dross and these kinds of, and then you get to purgatory, right? Like purgatory is a higher level where you actually realize that whatever torment there may be, it's present in order to burn off these things that can't exist in heaven. And then,
Mm.
you get something like, um, I forget who the Christian thinker who articulated this was, but it's a very influential, high level figure who talked about that the fire of hell is actually being present to the love of God and not being able to accept it.
Yeah, I would even say being present to how you've turned your back on the love of God and
Yeah.
not be, yeah.
Yeah.
And that is, you know,
Yeah.
I've
But even
always
if
liked
you,
the,
oh, sorry, even if you can't recognize how you turned your back on God, even the suffering that you experience is actually, it's like standing in front of the sun without sunglasses on.
yes, it burns you away. That's what I was about to bring up. I love the
Okay.
imagery, the idea of that God is the light that's too bright to look upon, because you can't bear to see what, you could have seen and what seeing really is,
Yeah.
basically. And your version of seeing is more or less having your eyes closed and feeling around compared to the illumination of truth of God and love. And
Yeah. Yeah. And this is what all the mystics talk about, right? I mean, this
yeah.
is the actual title of a book called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is from a anonymous monk in 10th century England who is a mystic, and it's a riff off of Dionysus or pseudo Dionysus, who's this Platonic Christian crossover, which is brilliant mystic insights. But they all, it's this thing of when you get to the place of non-knowing,
Yes.
when you get to the place where there is this, the only thing you have left, I think what the author of The Cloud of Unknowing says is something like when there's nothing left in anything that you are except a naked desire for God.
Mm.
Right. And I mean, if the God language is triggering, you can put love there, you can put the highest thing, whatever you want to say,
Mm.
any of those transcendental attributes. And that's the moment, that's the space in which you actually can see God.
Yeah. That's the awe. Awe is like the most stunning conception of what could be. That's kind of how I view God from just a personal perspective of, again, I imagine like the invigoration of every particle in the universe, like brightened, and consciousness being as rich as possible, just the beauty of the world, just rising up like a tidal wave and crashing over the earth and everyone, just that feeling of the sun on your face, like for everyone, but inside, like in your heart, when you look at yourself and it feels like the sun is looking at you. I think that's how I would describe connecting with God.
Yeah, wow, that's beautiful. I mean, I've been there. I've been there a few times, and
It's a good place.
I think that was a beautiful way. I think you put into words what I don't know that I could have put into words there, because that I very much resonates though.
Awesome.
And it's like that moment where this is the kind of moment where time disappears. It's so interesting how that works, because having had some of those moments and experiences, I come away from them, and it's so tremendously obvious to me the relative nature of time. Having that participatory and perspectival knowing.
If you can have hundreds of years of experience in a moment,
Oh yeah.
it's going to change your understanding of time. Like, that was the thing for me, especially before I became more spiritual, was, 80 years, come on, I need 400 at least to feel like I've had, my time here or whatever. But the more you realize how subjective time is and how much control you actually have over that, you realize, it feels that way if you're living on fast forward, which a lot of people are, and I certainly was. But you can hit slow mo too. It's a good place.
Yeah, if you believe that the 12-hour clock represents, or 24-hour clock represents an accurate and static movement of time, what you call time, that is what you will experience as time.
Mm-hmm.
And your experience of it will be ratioed off of the total that you think you've experienced. So when you're 5 years old, an hour seems like a long time. When you're 40 years old, an hour seems like a short period of time. But you can also just not, you can still use the clock for normal things in your day. You schedule those things and whatever. But
you don't have to ban them.
yeah. It's not like you have to become a hermit in the woods to do this. But you can move to a space where you recognize that when to the degree that your awareness is present in a moment, that moment is eternity.
Yes. And to the degree that your entire awareness is present in a moment, that is eternity. And less of your presence means time is moving faster, because the present moment is the place in which we form. The time space that exists. If our mind is a space-time interface, and the observer or the observation of the mind is a time space that looks at that space-time, we can be in the space-time or in the time space, but the more that we're in the time space, the more that we're the observer, the more that we're able to control or have a sense of the time in within the moment of our own creation, our own forming. And that's where you get eternity, because there is a tick rate to space-time, that follows the clock and all that. But in the time space, each moment is potentially eternal. And all that sets that tick rate is the amount your presence is there, the fullness with which you are with God. That's why the whole idea of eternity, there's what happens after death, but right now, eternity is a place that you can approach and work towards getting closer to.
Yeah, eternity is the now.
Yes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And
because it's outside of space-time.
Yeah. And you can add the functionality here, right? The means by which it happens that you do not experience eternity is that aspects of the power that is you, from a power perspective, are spending their energy trying to take aspects of space that you have experienced, and hold them rigidly to where they are.
Mm-hmm.
That's the precise definition of what the knowledge of good and evil means. And once that energy is committed, that amount of energy is constrained there, and it cannot be present. And so time is not available as the limitless potential of reality.
Mm-hmm. And so that is when that's happening, you're clutching the mountain. That's the grasping, that's the attachment, and the mountain forces its time scale on you. Whereas if you can let go of the mountain, you can apply your time scale to the mountain.
That's some high level analogy tying. Nice.
Nice. We're getting to that 3 in 1 kind of
that was very nice. That was very nice. Yeah. Time is one of the portals, there's different, looking back on my journey in sort of coming to man, it's so hard to find language that doesn't make it feel like I'm sounding pretentious even as I say it. But whatever this journey is, there's a way to say that the steps that arrived in my life that pulled my awareness off of the spaces where I was holding it, such that it was available to me to actually be in. is that
I'm with you. Yeah.
that felt better than what was wanting to come out otherwise. But there's many of those that seem like they're almost necessities to get to that place. And that may just be personal bias, but one of them seems to be this really thorough recognizing or remembering of the time principle,
Hmm.
because it is one of the ones that is so deeply and ubiquitously and insidiously present throughout humanity.
Yeah. And I think that that's, you know, what we literally are is time running through itself as a loop to navigate space-time. So to me, God and time are effectively the same thing, not the space-time time, but the super space-time. That's what God is really, that ultimate wholeness that's interpenetrating itself as we go through reality. So for me, the more you understand space, the more potential you have to understand time. It's more academic, but in your own mind, meditation, what it's trying to do is get you to identify with time rather than space, with the ability to be aware rather than the contents of awareness, because that separation is what gives you the frame freedom that we discussed, the ball bearing joint of selflessness.
Yeah, and learning how to use the ego, the thinking mind, the rationality, the beautiful tool that is, uh, Lucifer. If you're, it allows you to actually use that as the highest angel instead of experiencing it as Satan.
Yes, because all Satan is God turned away from himself into a self, and that's the process that's going on in you. Like God has become space-time and needs to re-become time to find himself, and that is us finding us and being God in the moment.
Yeah, yeah, and there's times that when I'm going in this, when I'm talking about things in this space where I'm like, okay, well, this feels so individualistic or something. But then,
Mm.
so then where I go from there is, okay, well, individual is a actual fractal pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually, this becomes very obvious, especially if you start to understand Jung and
Mm.
his student Eric Neumann. Have you ever read his book, The Origins and History of Consciousness?
I haven't. I've heard a lot of people talk about Jung, but not interacted with his or his students' work directly.
Okay. Yeah, I actually haven't interacted with Jung's work directly, but this is um, Eric Neumann, who is kind of I don't know. I mean, I guess I tend to think of him a little bit like Aristotle to Plato, but I don't know, that might be a little bit of a
Okay.
stretch. But
Sure.
I'm not trying to say that Jung is Plato, but anyway, he uses mythology and the archetypes that he interprets out of mythology to build an analogy for the development of consciousness of man, of humanity, and he traces it out. I think he does a really helpful job of explaining that frame. I'm not trying to say that frame is true, but it's incredibly insightful.
Valuable. Yeah.
And but one of the things that he continually points out, and just maybe my way of reading this is how it appears to me, is I see those archetypes having played out in my own life. And the ways in which I am embodying this archetype in this experience or in this time of my life or whatever. And so that's very much what I now do with any mythology that I interact with. I just take every aspect that is readily available to me or maybe presents itself to me and then map it onto my own life. And I very rarely come across one that doesn't map in so many interesting ways. I mean, it's not my life is all of these mythos, but there's there's ways in which the
You're
through
living out
lines.
the trials of Hercules, are you?
Yeah, yeah, but it's like it's the through lines of what this character is doing, and it shows you yourself, right?
Yes.
And so this is the. Did you look at those tweets, or did you see those tweets that I put out a few days ago about
I think so. Yes, I saw you do a thread that I thought was great, but I can't recall the content.
I wrote it out a little bit more, so let me pull it up here, and maybe I'll just read it to you really quickly. So this is kind of a rough sketch, but is that there are two primary axioms in the proper awareness of self in relation to reality. These axioms, if understood or known in the manner of all the 4 P's, afford a flow state relationship to all of reality in its dynamic unfolding. These 2 axioms are a paradox, which, if held properly, produce the optimal attention. They proceed as follows. I am that no thing to which all things happen. I am that which happens to all things.
Beautiful. I hadn't seen that. I thought you were talking about another thread. That's wonderful. Yeah, that's great. So that came from, it was influenced by that book, or what's the connection there? Because that sounds like your words, and sounds beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, well, I appreciate that. But yeah, it came directly out of just, I was reading that and doing that, right? Just mapping that on and starting to just really have a sense of this pattern, because he's doing it at such a macro scale of all of human history. And I'm like, wow, how is it that I can map all of human history onto my own life? And
Right.
this is just because it's a fractal pattern. Like your individual existence and experience of reality is a fractal of all.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in a certain sense, we're a fractal feeding a fractal, and that's recursion recurring into itself, and that's why some of these topics are so hard to talk about. Because I love that you use the word paradox there, because what looks like a paradox at one level of dimension is just lacking another way of looking at it, in which you understand how it's actually a recursion, something that is iterating upon itself through time and changing, rather than circular.
Yeah, and that's why I think that once you actually, it might actually be a reasonable kind of gauge as to where you can feel yourself in the journey, as to how able are you to actually see paradoxes. Because there's a paradox is always something that, from the conceptualization standpoint, cannot coexist as a true statement. And thus, in order to actually see how it can, and maybe in some sense deeply does, exist as a true statement, you have to be beyond that space. You have to be in the super space-time, right? You have to be outside of it and looking at all sides at once to see that it is the yin and the yang.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of, I think, how those words came to me, because it essentially reads as you cannot become more radically humble than to say, I am literally nothing at all, and nothing is in my power. It's abject radical humility. And then you cannot also, like, you simultaneously cannot get more, whatever, superior or whatever talking, than to say that I am that which happens to all things.
Yes. And it is not it's a seeming paradox, but it's not a contradiction, that you can be both of those at one time. And that's very hard to understand, because I think to map some of our mental models together here, what it's like in the default frame is you're moving along a line in space, and you don't have the freedom of even space-time. You have a trajectory, you have a momentum, you're just a single particle, almost a thought, going through that space. And then once you integrate the ability to think spatially and to conceive of things that way, you're empowering yourself to use the analog processor, that's combining thought and feeling and creating forms like that, as we discussed last time. That I view as almost a necessary step, not necessarily, but certainly a useful step in getting to super space time, because now you understand another thing that you are looking at, in which that means that you are not that thing, because there's a subject and object relationship. So it's like almost you do that with your thoughts, then you do it with thoughts and feelings, and then you can do it with time awareness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what to say. I think so. The second half of that, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the wording is 100% for me. So the
Sure.
first part feels, that feels very kind of settled when I say that. The
Mm-hmm.
second part feels quite settled, but I'm interested in looking at a little bit if you are.
Sure.
Saying I am that which happens to all things. What it looks like to me is that even as the smallest thing, which is a no thing of attention or awareness, because of the finite nature of it, based on what I behold or what I choose to place my attention on, and the manner in which I place my attention on it, it actually creates my environment.
Mm-hmm.
Because for one, it is literally what I will perceive of the world. But then the relationing aspect of it is the way in which I position myself toward the thing will create the emotional way in which it creates the world for me. So, which has
Yes.
this worlding aspect, right? Because there's one aspect where it's just like, oh, okay, there's a wall there, but whether I perceive that wall as keeping me safe or I perceive it as imprisoning me,
Mm-hmm.
radically changes my reality. So it is the case then that in some sense, all of what I call real is actually dependent on me, because so in that way, but then I'm immediately like, oh golly, there's something about that that's not right, because but I don't truly know how to think about that, because, and this is why, because I experience a thing and it feels to me as if it cannot possibly not be negative, right? It feels like something that should not happen. And
Yes.
so then immediately it becomes something I cannot control, and I'm unable to relate to it in the optimal manner.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it is perceived correctly, my ability to relate to it, there's a resistance there.
Yes.
And at that moment, that resistance inhibits the flow of my awareness into space. But I really do not know to what degree that actually precludes the thing from being what it should be, / is it what it should be just by me relating to it properly? Right? Like you have one side that's, kind of the Ram Dass thing of, don't you see that it's all perfect just the way it is?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so there's that abject humility towards it. But at the same time, there's also that creative aspect to it, is like, well, does my allowing of space for it in agape, right? By my showing agape to my own life. This is the thing that, like, you need to show agape to yourself. Like, if I could just, like, if I could put that in everyone's head, just like literally, like,
force teach, yeah.
just show agape for your own life.
Mm-hmm.
Man. So yeah, I don't know. There's that statement for me.
Okay, that's an enormous amount to take in. But I think I've got you. So Hmm. There's the contents of awareness, the thing that you're experiencing, and then your attachment to that content. And your attachment is the tension, right? It's this thing should be other than it is, or it needs to change. Um, I think this gets onto so many things. It gets into solipsism, and it gets into the fact that God is actually playing the game. It's not like, in my mind anyway, it's not like he unraveled a carpet and then looked away. He's the unraveling, he's the weaving of the thread of every moment, as us.
And this is the space from which miracles can come through human beings with the proper amount of faith.
Yes. And so what I would say then is basically, I'm not full Ram Dass in that everything is, I think we're agents of change for a reason. We're meant to change things. I'm not as passive as a Buddhist. I think that we were theologically, we were given that function for a purpose. And that's how I see it. And I think that now again, the ego self, everything inverts on that level. So on the ego self level, you're not going to make good changes, and so you shouldn't, even though you can. And that's kind of
the paradox of like, if you listen to what I'm saying from the level of the ego, this is the worst possible advice.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you listen to what I'm saying from the level of awareness, this is what you want.
Exactly. And the space in between is that purgatory space of being the witness, right? Where you are, I've even heard people say, like, I don't think consciousness does anything. Well, you can make it not do anything, but anyway. Yeah. So there's that's the space in between, and so sorry, I'm gonna go find that.
Oh man, that was so funny. That was beautiful. That was so beautiful. Anyway, okay. Yeah, okay. Sorry. All right.
So there's your attachment to the contents of awareness and your desire to tinge them the color that you are, the way that you would prefer them to be. And if you have, corruption or taint in your coloring, then that will be a net negative for the totality of consciousness. That will be a bad thing for humans, for everyone, for the universe. So I think that there is, but in that level, right? But then when you get out of that level and you're operating on the agape, full on agape level of truth and love flowing through seamlessly through your experience, and you being that and identified with that, that is the place of an empowered agent of change to co-create reality with the other fragments. That's the purpose of this whole thing, is to get into that space and create stuff in this sandbox. That's why we're here. And that's a beautiful thing, to do that and to change. That's why it's worth staying after, you've awakened or comes to some of these realizations. Otherwise, you might as well just end the game there. And that does happen, right? But the reason to stay is because as a, hard to pick the right word there, but as an empowered, aligned, rightful ruler of your segment of space-time, that is the gift God has given us on earth. And that is, that's what the spiritual path leads people to, is that, again, you really are what you wish you were, but only through that journey.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yes, because then this is the space where, this is the space. One aspect of it is that you are engaged in such a way that your goal is to bring the most beautiful thing that could possibly be to be. And because that is the space in which you are, that is what happens. Because you actually have the power to do that, because that is your goal, because it's all aligned. So that's one aspect. There's another in which it's the space from which you realize that you are not only are you the same as the other person you're talking to, no matter what the situation is, you're actually it's a consubstantiation kind of ontological reality of the level at which you are you when you're in that space connects to the level of them that is you.
Yes.
And you can actually
Yes.
speak to that space, like, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and there's a lot of levels between there and where you're just pure ego consciousness trying to force yourself on other people. And this is this like going all the
Oh
way
yeah.
back, into my day-to-day interactions with patients. To the degree to which I'm successful in really creating space for people, it's the degree to which I'm able to be in that space where I'm seeing that this is me in
Mm.
this moment and connecting on that level where I actually have that sense of how would I want to be treated in this situation, and asking that question on the deepest level, and then having no goal except to meet this person in the way that I would hope to be met.
Yes. Yes. And that is it, because I am a doorway to God, and so are you. And agape is the openness of the door.
Mm.
And so God can fly through my doorway through yours, and recursively, that is what the fluidity of these conversations is allowed for, is when we both have our door all the way open,
Mhm.
that God is just ripping through the hallway without any, and it's fun. There's a reason
Yeah,
that feels good. But yeah.
yeah,
um
yeah. It's funny. My wife, as an aside, my wife, because I have to calm that down just for a second because that's a lot.
Sure. Yeah.
That's a lot to
Sure.
look at. I mean, it's great, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
But as an example, my wife this morning, she was like, "Oh my gosh, you've got a busy day today,"
Hmm.
and I was like, "Yeah, yeah, it's busy." And she was like, "Yeah, and then you've got the conversation this evening," and I was like,
Hmm.
"Yeah, but like sometimes they go and play softball, and it kind of feels like that, right? It's just,
Yeah.
but better, but like
Hmm.
kind of like that. 'Cause, yeah,
Relieving rather than draining. Yeah.
yeah,
Because it's connecting to source effectively.
yeah. Well, and it's one of those things where you know I've certainly had engagements where I've engaged in this kind of space, in the kind of dialogical space,
Mm.
and I have tried to contain it.
Mm.
I've tried to feed on it, and I notice
Right,
when,
like put yourself above super space time. Yeah, that's
yeah,
the trick.
yeah, yeah, and then yeah, try to hold on to that aspect of high, right? Because it's a high.
Mm-hmm.
um and then and then inevitably wherever I am then becomes the low. And so that's kind of the egoic danger that I face on occasion
Mm-hmm.
from that.
No, the ego is always looking for a way. Hey, look what I can do. It's like, no, that happened because you weren't doing it. But again,
Yeah,
it will never stop trying to play those games and tricks, right?
yeah, yeah. So if let's go back there. um so there's this way in which when you were saying that, I kind of even just kind of envisioned, right, like caricature you and I as doorways with some kind of like, what, I don't know, like the Hadron Collider maybe, right, going
Yeah,
around
yeah.
between us. And yeah, and then I was thinking, right, so you've classified that space as being the space where your awareness fully inhabits the super space-time frame.
And
And
therefore has no rigidity to any motion from you or me. As soon anything you send me is fully received,
yeah,
and vice versa. And so that's where you get this um, hyper resonance. It's almost like a resonance of a meta resonance,
hmm,
where things land in the way they're most effectively received in both directions. And then you just language becomes this just like almost foolish thing. Like if we were in person, I would love to meet you at some time in person,
yeah,
because I
yeah,
think we would get this physically as well. And that's hard to do through the computer. But I mean,
yeah,
that would be probably quite intense and cool.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so. I've thought about that as well. um I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I don't think that the dialogical space, and you and I seem to be particularly well suited for it. But that dialogical space is, when I experience that space, it feels like the religious spiritual mystical experiences that I've had. And I've had some
Yes.
mystical experiences in a meditative space that are far higher resolution reality than anything that I've experienced in the, just kind of what we would call normal waking consciousness. And it's like that. It's like that, where the words, it's still the same words, but they just change. They're no longer kind of here and there. They're heavy, and they just land.
Well, you're in eternity, right? And so every word that lands is landing with the impact of the entire cosmos. Like true truth. When we deal with language, we're dealing with pebbles, but true truth, real reality on this level is like opening the door of the cosmos, opening your door, and having galaxies pour through. And you're like, that's what it's like. That's why all the memes are like, that's what's going on. You're absorbing the entire information density of the whole cosmos as it's reaching your frame, and doing that without resistance. I mean, we actually need an ego, and we need some of these things to just not be paralyzed by the intensity of that at all times, in a certain sense.
Yeah, and this is, again, you can just take this to the straight materialistic framework, and it plays perfectly. This is literally just the fact that there is no physical component of your brain. There is no aspect of your body. There is no there's no material way in which any of your energy is being spent on anything but the now.
Yes.
And because it is fully in the now, and it's not holding on to anything, all the subconscious, unconscious structures that God only knows how they work, and how they exist, and how you are engaged with them, like whether it is encoded in physical reality, or whether it, is some kind of like, I don't know, like waveform or something. Like, I have no idea what it is. I have no idea how it works. But I know that it is way bigger and way deeper than anything we can consciously imagine at all. Because obviously, whatever our consciousness is, that is conscious of itself, evolved from it. Like, it's a huge deal. But sorry, tangent. But when all of that is allowed to be what it is, and all of this waking consciousness is actually just engaged in the moment being, creative rationality and truth telling and sense making and relevance realization. And when it does its show, and its whole show is focused on the current moment, then data is perfectly picked up in its proper relevant forms, and it's perfectly integrated, and it works.
And it's not a subtle difference. Like, again, it's like 1,000 times. Like,
it's like, have you seen the movie Limitless?
Yeah.
It is exactly
that. Yeah, and essentially that's because you're engaging with processors that have entirely different capabilities, right? Like, the digital processor is very linear. The analog processor is entirely parallel. Like, the whole thing is happening at once, and that's part of what you're getting there. But then at the quantum level, what you're getting is actually the play between the digital and the analog. Basically, when you put them together the right way, they expose all other, like literally everything else there is. And you get all three through all the processors. And when all three processors are open and integrating without any resistance, that is the galactic waterfall just pummeling you. And again, see, that can actually be terrifying. If you don't know what's going on and that's happening to you, and you're like, it's hitting you, that's a bad trip. That's what's happening. But if
that's why you don't do psychedelics when you're when you're not prepared.
Exactly. Don't mess around. Yeah. But when you understand it and you know what's going on there, then you can become that waterfall, and then you are thundering through the cosmos, and you get all those experiences that are so hard to explain in words. But that space of, you literally are becoming total possibility. That is what it's like to be, an infinite possibility drive, like the universe is.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is just to speak to that like materialist angry thing in my head, that the the reason I bring up psychedelics there is not some abstract analogic relationship only, although it is a deeply abstract analogical. Like we could go down that rabbit hole, but I don't even have to, because like the actual um, the actual scientific understanding that we have of psychedelics, to the degree that we have any, indicates that what they actually do is turn your brain fully online and allow it to talk to itself in ways that it doesn't otherwise.
Yeah.
And the research in psychology on actual human people who have real issues and real difficult things that they can't get away from, that they're stuck in, addictions and PTSD and serious issues. These people have one experience on these substances in the right setting with the right support, and they like things fundamentally shift about their life, like
Yes.
fundamentally and incredibly positive.
Absolutely.
And
Because now your data streams aren't fighting each other, but they're unifying into something that begins to make sense to you.
Yeah.
Whereas prior to that, your identity, your presence is only in one of them, can't find the other ones, and that resistance, that intention, is killing you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why oh man, just lost it. Sorry, pick up. That one's good.
Well, I wanted to actually move into like the super material space of quantum mechanics as it relates to attention and all that we're talking about there, because I think I can do it at a similar level without getting too technical.
Okay.
So I think that what awareness is, I'm really coming to this place where awareness is the entanglement, quantum entanglement of self and other. So when I look at something, I create it and myself as a relationship through attention and intention. Intention being the difficulty, resistance to integration of the processors. Okay, so there's 3 different versions of me and they fight each other. That's intention. Attention is my awareness and the identity occupying my consciousness. The difference between how things would integrate if I were in either place there, if I was in space-time or super space-time.
It's the fact that there actually is a map.
Yes.
That you actually think there is a map.
Right. So what the entanglement of awareness, which I think is a quantum process, is the mapping of self to experience. So you define the relationship of what you're seeing by what you think you are in the moment of your seeing it, which is your presence in the processors.
So, and this is why you get things like projection, where like someone else does something and they mean something by it, but you can only understand it from the perspective that you would do that thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or how you would feel if you were doing that thing.
Yes, because your mental ears or your mental eyes are they can only see the way in which you know how to see. And so that's how you connect yourself to experience. And so the reason why, meditation and these practices getting to super space-time, root awareness, is so powerful is because you now can completely define yourself in the moment to whatever is optimal. There's no resistance to that other side of that equation with everything you look at. It can become the most beautiful, perfect thing imaginable. In fact, in every moment, all that prevents it from being so is you defining yourself as something that has a smaller relationship to it, or a lower level relationship to that object.
I have become all things to all people.
Yes. Yeah. And so that quantum entanglement, I mean, a lot of times people jump to the word quantum to just like fill in something they don't know. And so I want to try and not do that. I want to say very specifically, the reason I'm saying that is because in a classical space-time, you always have a subject-object relationship. But in the quantum realm of super space-time, you can actually have two relationships at once co-occurring, and that is how space and time interact. And it is also how awareness and the contents of the awareness interact.
Oh, okay. Yeah. 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 Oh, that's cool. That's cool because that really is, I mean, like, not that I understand quantum physics fully, but to the degree that I do, that seems to be the central thesis is that really everything is relative, and
Yes.
and the existence of any current moment is kind of a flip of a coin contingency.
Yeah. So effectively, what I'm describing there is the the implications of relativity on subjectivity. That subjectivity itself is fundamentally relativity through what is and what am I. That is the root programming of awareness. It's a membrane that says what's on that side, what's on this side. And the trick is it's a quantum process. It's deciding what's on either side at the same time, which actually means there is no sides. Like they're the same thing, which is all that quantum process. It's all time and space-time. It's the same origin that's creating that. So it's almost like we live in between panes of a mirror.
Yeah,
And
yeah. No, that's a good way of saying it. That's a very good way of saying it.
we receive and project. And how you find your true self, what awareness can do that the ego can't do, is look at the surface and how the surface, the membrane of awareness, of consciousness, is distorting what's being received and what's being projected. Because when you combine digital and analog information, thoughts and feeling, if you do that, if you integrate them perfectly, you get quantum information. It is the sum of those two things. Yeah. So you can now actually see not just what's coming in and what's coming out, but you can see inside the reception, the taking in and the putting out. And that's where the self lives. Identity lives there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's also the creation of a fractal pattern, really.
Yes.
Because you in order to do that, somehow I'm in here looking out through this, but then I move into the space where I'm actually outside of this, looking around this. Mm-hmm. and then all of a sudden there's that realization sense of, maybe realization is the right word, of the wrapping back through that happened, that's recursive. Yeah. Right? Because this is the journey of Christ to hell, right? Mm-hmm. This is the death and resurrection. This is the baptism. This is that it's the space where you go from infinite unity to infinite fragmentation and throughout.
Absolutely. And then so, what at first I say the face looking back at the face, or you can, if you like the mirror analogy, like the two panes of the mirror or two eyeballs. At first it seems like there's one eyeball, then you realize there's another one that can look back. And then you realize, maybe it's like there's two eyeballs like this. And then you realize like it's actually the light traversing between the membrane and creating the structure on either side, and the deflection of that light and distortion of that light. That whole process is what we are. That's how the mental interface works. And root awareness is always in that space of what is and what am I. And when you unify those things so that there's a single answer that satisfies both of them, that is effectively ending the philosophical torment of constant questioning and getting to a space of genuine self-empowerment, because then you don't have to have one of the processors halt the other ones worrying that they're not being taken into account, because you have a holistic integration that all of them are seeing loop in and out and feeling properly treated in that relationship, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. And when we think of, reference, pay homage to enlightened beings, they are beings who have embodied that space in a flow state throughout some, you know, a duration of their physical journey.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because just getting there doesn't keep you there. There's almost a gravity or a momentum to fall back down. Yeah, it's trying to hold your arm up. It's exhausting.
This is me, right? Yeah. Like that is exactly me, right? Like, yeah. I will get glimpses and even sometimes spend time in that space, but yeah, it's just a matter of you get better. Like, it's not like you get better. It's just it's the unstoppable process, right? You can just go right back into it from anywhere you come into the ego, right? Because you drop that back into this ego space where I'm saying I'm trapped, and then you recognize that to the degree that it is getting better in my life, because it is not because of anything that I'm doing. It's simply because the fact that I am allowing that space to occur is recursively creating itself.
Yes. Which is the best possible thing we can do if we understand how human consciousness operates theologically, what the function of it is. I actually think that the function implies purpose. I think that that's the right way to understand those things. And so I think that there is a place where we can say, you know, based on what humans are, there is a right way of being them. And it gets into a lot of tricky territory there, but because there's a lot of things I don't mean like that sounds like, but there is a sense in which, and I love our conversations because I feel like this is a very natural, we draw each other to this space very beautifully. And there's a natural, you know, when you're in that space, it's obvious that that is what well-being is. Mental health is just described by being in that state that we're talking about.
Yes.
And dishealth or hell or whatever, that's just the opposite direction.
Yeah. Like, yeah. Because both are just an amalgamation of all things good and all things bad.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why in every single moment, because it's a fractal, you can see all of human history in what you're experiencing in a single moment, because it's ultimately of the same nature.
Yeah, because
So now let's talk about the afterlife. Because we tried to go there and I brought us back for a second. But...
No, that was great. Well, so okay, in order to talk about the afterlife, we have to transition from the space that we were just talking, because in speaking of the space where we were just talking, to introduce the afterlife into that space is an absurdity, right?
The awareness doesn't have an afterlife. It's almost like after body.
yeah, because it's not like literally, like from that space, literally the only thing that then happens is just like when you drop your body, you just suddenly see how it is.
Your body. It's perfect description. But
like
physical.
Yeah, like, but you see what it is. You know, and I don't know, you know, there may be a way in which that only actually happens if you already understand what it is, because there's a lot of these things that are that way. You know, those, you know, to you it has been given to know, right? But to them it is not. All those kinds of things, like it's very clear across human history, I think that, spiritual secrets are not secrets because no one says them to you. It's because you just don't know what they mean.
Yeah.
And no one can tell you what they mean until you just see it. And that's grace, right? And so if you have not been granted the grace to have to become in, I don't know, whatever it is, right? And I
Mm.
don't know what that is. Like, I'm not at all saying that necessarily the space we just described is necessarily that, because I don't know. But
Mm.
If what we were talking about has any merit at all, it's you, yeah, maybe you get to the degree that you've been granted the grace to see what reality is and see through reality and to see into God. That is the
Mm.
level at which you understand. And maybe one of those levels, the afterlife is reincarnation. Maybe one of
Yeah.
those levels, the afterlife is purgatory. Like, we can't, I don't know, like, I don't see why there's any arbitrary rules about it. Like maybe,
Yeah.
there's no like real forever. I think that would be something that I would say is like, as soon as you start talking about the ultimate kinds of things, it's like, no, there's no forever.
Mm.
I mean, there is, but not in the way that you exist as a separate entity. Like,
Certainly, yeah.
Forever as a concept cannot exist if there are separate entities, basically.
Yeah, I mean, separate entities are actually formed only in a moment, and if they happen to reform similarly in the next moment, that's the result of the system. But I don't think they actually have a perpetual. Um, okay, space-time is a static slice. That's what it is, and so therefore it exists only as a single frame. And if you have a system like the human body that recreates that frame for a time, okay, sure, but it's not actually continuous because only time is continuous. So um, basically, the confusion comes from because you actually are awareness pretending you're not. And so you are eternal, but the thing you think you are is only exists for a moment, literally just enough for your identity to act as an operating system. So your actions occur. And then next moment, your brain recreates who you are, what you are. And this is why whenever you're around a different person, there's a chameleon-like nature to everyone's personality.
Totally. Yeah, very much. Yeah. So do you think that there's a way in which that the ego is experienced as the true self, right? So in that kind of lost frame, say the way I said it was not having fully received the grace, is there a way in which from that frame the after death experiences are more what is laid out on the lower levels? Or do you think that upon the dropping of the body, the individuality that is bound up with being in a body, as far as we can tell, do you think it continues beyond the body if if maybe say a certain amount of grace has not been given or whatever?
Yes. Okay. So when you die, you drop your body. Your body is your analog and digital processor. So in my frame, right? So they're gone. So now you're quantum information, but quantum information can represent digital and analog information perfectly. The other two can't represent quantum information without each other being integrated, but quantum has the capacity, as time has the capacity to suspend and animate space, it has the capacity to do that and retain that form informationally. And you'll actually hear physicists say there's no information ever lost because the quantum field actually, it's technically there. Now, good luck extracting it, but it's technically there.
Of course, it has to be, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about the afterlife, in my view, what you're talking about is you're talking about those two processors turning off, and the thing we really are, quantum information, as a form. And I'm just open on this right now. I don't know. There's two
No, I see it.
possibilities.
Keep going. Yeah, no, keep going.
In one possibility, that form merges with the wholeness of reality, becomes one, and goes back to, the witnessing God that is playing the game.
Sure.
And maybe, who knows what that's like. What we're talking about here is what is total possibility like?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
a couple conceptions that seem, the closest I can get myself to it. Maybe you have a screen of every human in the entire world, and you're watching all of them at once, but you can jump in,
Yeah.
I don't know. Or
Yeah.
maybe you retain the form that you had when you died.
Mm.
And now again, you definitely go to the same space as God. You're going to the quantum realm only.
Mm.
So that's the spiritual realm. So you're no longer in space time. You're now in super space time.
Mm-hmm.
And there might be something it's still like to be a fragment there,
Mm-hmm.
either to be it or to interact with it. And again, who knows? Maybe different, because the ego is something that exists on a spectrum. Your integration, right? It's not like you did it or you didn't, because there's glimpses and you turn it on and off. So there's this giant spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And it could be that certain spectrums, for whatever reason, it's hard for me to justify this, but I can't say why not. So there could be that if you don't get integrated enough, you come back. I've heard arguments there that you can make some sense of. Or it could be that in total possibility, instead of there being one being, all the fragments still exist and they all interact with each other all the time, but more like the common conception of heaven. And you are just in the form that you finished in. Or maybe you can even select any of the forms you ever were throughout your life. If maybe you had to mention at the end, you want to go back 10 years before you die. I don't know, but all of that information is there and in theory accessible to super space-time, which doesn't have to navigate space-time to get it.
I think it's,
Oh,
oh man, yes. Oh, that works really nicely, man. That was really beautiful. Okay, because I think that using that kind of I don't know, whatever that is it metaphysics? Um,
yes, yeah.
if you use
Information
that,
theory. Yeah.
yeah, if you use that model, you actually like I can it I'm watching each of the different afterlives understandings mythologically.
Mm.
Like I'm just playing them over that frame space that you just built, and they all seem to work really well.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens once you from that metaphysical space, not only are all of them simultaneously possible, they're all almost simultaneously proven, because the way, like, there's this, because the fractal has to be a fractal all the way down throughout the ego too, there's a
Yes.
way in which every imagination, every fantasy becomes enacted.
Yeah.
um and so it becomes realized. uh this is
So,
part of why there's no such thing as non-real.
well, and then so maybe then events occurred a certain way in space-time that we're experiencing, but that wouldn't be enough. That wouldn't be the whole game, the total possibility space. In the
Yeah.
total possibility space, all of the creatures that were ever created through all of time would then go to a place outside of that linear time place and interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be that higher realm, heaven, or one step below, depending on how you're viewing that, like a segment of heaven where all forms ever formed now reform each other, because why not? Because God is the most meta thing ever. And
This actually sounds very much like um, Thomas Aquinas's metaphysics, which is Christianity and Plato and Aristotle
merged. Yeah.
merge, which is, this is like the ideas of God, the ideas that exist in the mind of God, which are Platonic ideas essentially.
Mm.
Not, I don't know if that's perfectly, but to offend my.
No. So yeah, I want to jump on that because Platonic ideals, I think we've touched on that a couple of times, and
Yeah.
that's the exact right word, because um, what a it's basically what is the perfect form of a thing. So what a form is, thinking geometrically, thinking spatially for a moment, is nodes of information set in relation to each other.
Yes.
That's all a form is. Okay.
In some specific pattern.
Yeah, the tension between the nodes, the properties.
Sure.
That's what a form is. And so all forms inherently, through their own self-description, which is that form, have a maximal version of themselves.
Yeah.
That's the Platonic ideal. The idea of this land of forms, that forms themselves exist on a spectrum of goodness, just inherently through structure of information.
Yeah.
I mean, that's modernized, but so if we're talking about Buddha, or someone who's gotten all the way to that space, the door's totally open every moment of their life, or as close as humans have ever gotten.
Yeah.
What they're doing is getting close to the Platonic ideal of being a human, which is the spiritual path. And maybe, just to go the other way, I don't necessarily believe this, but just to put all the potentials of the afterlife on there, maybe you only those forms get to go to heaven and be something that interacts with God. And the other one, like maybe he's trying to create friends to hang out with, but he's got some criteria, and yeah, that's what this whole thing is. Who knows, right? But,
yeah. Well, that I must have lost you there, because that doesn't seem to map, right? You're saying that specific level can exist if you're stuck in that level of the ego?
Well, what I'm saying is that could be another layer of reality. Again, these aren't things that I necessarily think are likely. But
Sure.
Let's say you have the ego identified people in one room, and you could tier it. A lot of traditions have done that. So I'm just trying to allow space to understand their thinking.
Yeah.
I actually think it's most likely that you just become God. I think that the ego dropping away, and sure, maybe in total possibility you can interact with any of those forms, but I still think you're probably just the one thing doing it.
Sure. Yeah.
Because we laugh when we say things similar to that, and I think that's a giveaway.
Yeah. The idea of the through line. And this is something that I don't have a great understanding of how AI works, but in my sense of kind of how AI works, in, like, say you ask it to generate an image of a bird, right?
Yes.
And what the AI does is take all images of bird that it has ever interacted with and mashes them all together, and the through line of each aspect that comes up, of each pixel, really, isn't that what it is?
Yes.
In that case, it's like each individual pixel is analyzed through all the frames, and then whatever comes out of that is what you get.
Yes. It's just an averaging of bird-like things that it has taught to label as birds. It's basically creating a Platonic ideal. That's what those machines are doing and representing. Now, I think there's a lot of fuzziness to how it happens, that if you were to do that, if you were literally to try and make a machine to create a Platonic ideal, it would probably be slightly different than how they work now. But rough idea.
Maybe here's an idea. Would it be like much more, I don't know, true to that goal of producing a Platonic idea if all the information it had access to was information provided by humans that never intentionally manipulated it?
Okay, say it again, because I couldn't grab it.
Okay, so like, say some AI has access to all of Google. Sure. And you ask it what a bird is, and it gives you some image. Now, if every image it analyzed was taken from, like, every person who'd ever seen that image was like, yep, that's a bird. And like in the real sense of what we mean when we think about an actual bird that flies in the air, right? And you didn't have some abstract paintings and all this other stuff in there. Like, if that were the case, with all the information that was available to the AI, that it had never been manipulated, would it produce something more like a Platonic idea?
I think if you went to one species of bird, it would.
Yeah.
So I think it would basically a category error where a hummingbird and an eagle don't have the same platonic ideal.
Sure.
So,
Okay.
but at the level of resolution at which it would work, like what is a platonic ideal of an eagle? I think so. I think I think you would get um, the best looking eagle, basically.
Yeah. 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 That's
And I think that's
interesting.
what beauty is. I think, by the way, I think
Yeah.
that is the most idealized version of that property relationship in a sense.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. Well, and that fits with kind of the way we were describing the momentary engagement of enlightenment when that all systems are online and all systems are correctly engaged. In a lot of ways, the actual intelligence of the processor that is like an artificial intelligence, that's just what it's doing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Is it's like this became so apparent to me when I was watching the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lectures.
Mm.
Like when he's talking about the cognitive science of memory or um, biases and how we bias incoming information
Mm.
and its correlational patterns and all these kinds of things. It's like really what our brain is doing is just trying to do that kind of through line aspect with as many different aspects of realities it can get its hands on.
Yeah, it's a line of best fit, and that's how we start to form our ontology. Like, what are the categories of things, and how do those categories relate to each other? That's the what it. That's how our mind answers the what is question, and the what am I question is actually just so the what is question is a passive stance to it, and the what am I question is the active stance. Effectively, what is and what should I do given what should be. That's basically what that system is.
Yeah, nice. This one of the other things that Reiki talks about is how you perceive things as real, which you have more data intake from. So that is this as well, right? Like when you see a shadow behind a bush and then you no longer see it, you think, well, I maybe just saw that, right? But if you see a shadow behind a bush and then you reach out and touch it and there's something there and it makes a noise, right? Now all of a sudden you have three senses telling you, hey, maybe there's something here. You're much more likely to believe it's real.
Yes. I think we talked about the Sudoku puzzle idea that the whole universe is a giant Sudoku puzzle, and your brain is trying to figure out what the numbers are. And you're basically lining up columns and rows. Like, okay, I heard that it couldn't be anything else, but with only one data point, you can't really fill in the puzzle convincingly to yourself.
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it. And lying to yourself is just like purposefully putting in the
Just
wrong numbers.
carve a 3 in, like taking the stickers off the Rubik's Cube and just,
Yeah. And then you're surprised when you try to stand on it and it breaks.
Yeah.
Like
I mean, it is that foolish when at the most fundamental level.
Yeah.
But see why this all happened. I'm so interested in this layer. Like, why is the game made this way? Like, why is consciousness a self-honesty machine? Because it functionally is.
Agape, right? Agape for yourself.
Yeah. And so it's almost like it's like a system that's optimized. Its own well-being is optimized based on self-honesty, but there's some part of the system whose sole goal seems to be, I don't know, you're already that. You're already the best thing possible. Don't worry about this other information. Like, it's trying to justify what you already are. So it's like, so there's like self-honesty. That's fundamentally how the system works. But there's this other part that's almost the total opposite of that, which is self affirmation, or just slamming your fist down and insisting upon what you are is the total opposite of self-honesty. And that's the ego just being like, I'm already there, I've done it. The worst way of saying I am God, that is what the ego is doing. And
Totally.
it is literally resisting all of nature. It's fighting the entire cosmos just to insert itself and say, I am what I am.
Yep.
I am because I think, that classic quote, right? So why is that the setup that we're dealing with here?
So
I always go back to that.
So first of all, I want to map the Christian story onto what you just said, because that was perfect. So the way I think of it is that the totality is the coming into form of the Godhead, right? That is what the totality is. And then evolution is literally.
Can you describe Godhead, because I'm not familiar with that term enough to know.
Yes, Godhead is like shunyata. It's like it's the ground of no thingness. It's the field of pure potentiality. It's the no thing that is everything. It's the unity. It's the Tao. It's
okay. Yeah.
And it's so just the formness that comes into the form of that, right? That is still the thing, right? But that's the total frame space.
Yes.
And I guess I kind of think of it like with time as your x-axis and awareness of self-awareness as your y-axis. You have some kind of maybe, I have no idea exactly how the function looks, but it's some kind of upward trending function that eventually reaches the totality of itself. But the movement of time, as we understand it in the physical plane, is this form starts as the most simple, basic, whatever, just molecules, whatever was after the Big Bang. And it gradually, evolution happens, however the hell it happens. And, but it's also creation, right? It's not dead. It is the thing in and of itself. It is the thing itself. And it's alive. The whole thing is alive. Like the rock is not dead. Like if the rock is dead, then we're dead. You cannot make that case. But anyway, in the unfolding of time is the unfolding of experience. That's what a time is. And so it's the experience. Like, we can't imagine what it's like to be a rock, and maybe there is nothing with what it's like to be a rock, in the sense that we think there is something to be like something, but clearly there is a rock. And so if there is a rock, then, well, there's a rock. And so eventually you get to the space where maybe all things become conscious of themselves, or however. I have no idea where I have no idea where we're where this goes to. But in this model, then also, this is also the same space in which to talk about the Christ story, which is also the story of the individual self and the story of Satan, because they're bound up in each other. The fall and Satan and Adam is the development of self-awareness to the degree that we now have Lucifer on board, which is our own rationality, our own conceptual mapping, our own abstracting capabilities, something like that. And at the point where that becomes obsessed with itself, then it takes you all the way back to the bottom, because you, as a self-conscious conscious of itself, has to go all the way down to the ground of nothingness. Like, you have to do the journey too. So all of reality is doing the journey in the whole space, but you in your own individual life have to go the journey. That's the hero's journey. But it also had to happen in the physical space, literally. And this is why the incarnation is necessary. And this is why the death and resurrection of Christ is necessary, such that the whole becomes the one through all the ones.
Yes. Okay, great. So what you're talking about there is the relationship between the fragment and the whole. And I think what you're getting at, which is fantastic, is the idea that there's a constant motion through all of those layers into each other, right? The present moment is recurrent, a current recurrence. It's a recursion within a recursion, basically. And so there's constant motion, constant space is forming time is forming space, and space-time is forming super space-time as they flow back into each other. And in a certain sense, then, this maps Christianity to Buddhism very directly, what I'm going to try and do here. Basically, God is a direction of motion, is the togetherness, the towardsness of things, of self. If everything is basically a self-reference at the start and we're just kind of moving off of it, God is the togetherness, the unity, the towards, God is towards unity as emotion. Mm-hmm. And Satan is towards further fragmentation. Mm-hmm. In the moment, through our actions or through all of space-time, it's let's get further away. Let's work together worse. Let's have more resistance. So it's Satan is the individuation of all the parts of that wholeness, the fragmentation. It's like, let's bust it up more. Let's make it into more individual pieces. And God is the motion of coalescing, combining all those things through love to act as one. Mm-hmm. And we as humanity sit between the coalescing force and the fragmenting force. Mm-hmm. And decide what we want to be and who we are as some combination of that through our own being.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that is that. Yes, I think that is very, that I see that very clearly, especially as long as we speak from the level of still being an object subject, like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep. That. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. That is. Yep. And because then if you go up the level from there, you because this is like the purgatory space that you're talking about with Buddhism, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. This is totally the purgatory space.
Exactly. Yes. And the reason, so one of the things that like just gets me, I don't think it's right about Buddhism is that or just New Age spirituality in general, that outside of religion. So I think there's a lot of trends there that are not truthful. And so because they tend to try and drop space-time, they want to say your only time, your only the spiritual is real.
There's a Gnostic aspect.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the issue with that is you can't describe to a human what they are as what they think they are. And I think you need that layer in order to help people on the journey to go through. At least it's helpful. And to tell the whole story, you need all the parts. I just think that you're tossing away your mother for your father kind of idea there.
Yes. So Neumann talks about this. He talks about this because he describes the evolution of consciousness as coming out of the mythologically Ouroboros snake eating its own tail space, where the self is so unconscious of itself, but it's fully immersed in the flow. It's pleasurable. It is that sense of oneness, but there's no differentiation. And then it's the whole hero's journey to move out of that space. And this is why I think Christianity and Buddhism play so well together, and why I actually do think Christianity in its deepest ontology supersedes Buddhism, actually, is that it maintains that this world, this creation, in the way that we experience it, down to the smallest, down to the most painful, down to the most agonizing aspect that is, is still good and it's still worth redeeming. It's
And it's
so worth
real.
it's
It's
so
real.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. And
Mhm.
this is why, like, and this to get to this space, like I hope I get to talk to John Vervaeke again soon. And this is the kind of space that I would love to get to with him
Mhm.
because I think he sees this. I'm not quite sure. Like, I just love to talk to him about it because I'm so
Mhm.
curious where he would go with that and what he thinks about it.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating. Look forward to that.
Maybe I'll, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't want to presume on him, but maybe I'll ask him if he would be willing to watch this video first because I wonder
Probably like
what
it.
he
It
would
would
think.
be, yeah, pretty interesting. Just from my understanding of his work, I think this is a very related. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like it is, but I don't know.
Mhm. You always try.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, what were you gonna say?
Oh my goodness, there was so much there.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this is one of the things that I'm always checking against, right? This is one of the axioms that I've learned the value of actually going down the hole, right? Of actually going down the rabbit hole of it's all unity, it's all illusion,
Mm,
right? Like, I mean, for one thing, like if you truly and honestly go on those journeys, they're incredibly like they're fun, they're great, they're amazing, right?
mhm,
Um, but the crash at the bottom, especially depending on how attached you are, can be really, really devastating. I
mhm,
mean, I think that's where some of the things with the dark night of the soul, um, I think that has play there, right? The dark night of the soul is one that I'm very hesitant to look at because there was a time where I was flying high for like a really significant period of time, like
mm,
it was probably almost 5 months where I was just really like I was in the space a lot of the time,
mm.
and
Awesome.
it was, yeah, it was amazing. But I I think I know actually there was a time that I kind of almost articulated it a little bit to my wife where I was like, I don't know if these people that thought the dark night of the soul was the thing. I don't know if that's really a thing. And I
Mm.
think I paid for that one. I think I paid for that one because I had a rough period of time there for a little while on the crash
Yeah.
after that one. So I'm very like cautious to um, tread around the dark night of the soul idea.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to go there when and
I mean,
as
I'm
you
interested.
are.
I'm super interested to hear your perspective. I'm
I
just
see.
might be hesitant about how I speak about it because I'm not
Sure.
sure the power of my own words.
Yeah. So definitely there's still more for me to go through there. I should just say that. And part of what I feel is my body is emotions, and it is something I'm still working through. So I speak knowing I have more uh you know lake of fire to walk through. So what I think that is really the unconscious. I think a lot of what we're talking about here is operating on the subconscious, which some version of you, one of the processors is aware, and it's the other one's not listening, and that's the intention. But I think the dark night of the soul stuff is the unconscious, which is the literal opposite of you. And so when you're talking about someone who your identity is becoming God, you're becoming cosmos, totality of consciousness, and the invigoration of that, the beauty, the life, the fulfillment of that. What your unconscious becomes is Satan.
Mm. Oh, yes, yes,
And,
yes. The
and
higher you go, the lower you go.
absolutely. And so the higher your true self goes towards God, the darker your opposite becomes. And that's why we got into some of those, looking at the darkest moments of human history and recognizing you're responsible because you're the only player of the game.
Yeah, I mean
And
that's
yeah,
deeply analogous, or not. That is so works with that vision that I had that one time.
absolutely. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, that is the that's, it's interesting how hard that is. I want to touch on that later, but it's the hardest thing for us to do is admit that we are actually our own opposite, that we're all the other players of the game that we dislike or have bothered us, and because we've formed ourselves in relation to them. I am not this person who did this to me. I would never do that. that's a harsh reality to realize that no, you are, and that's all that there is, basically, right? Like
Yeah. This is why
it's
every
it's
polarity creates its opposite pole.
and it's ultimate responsibility, which is terrifying for the ego, whose sole job is to escape responsibility at every possible turn.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Like when I was writing out kind of more some of my thoughts related to that, I don't know, whatever you call it. It's almost like a Zen cone that I put together there.
mm-hmm.
That was what I was, that first aspect of the statement is the the consciousness from which freedom and joy and um, peace come, right? That sense of I am nothing at all,
Yes.
absolutely nothing. Like that is the place where you sink, and this is the place of oneness. This is the direction from which that it's all an illusion, and it's all okay, right? At the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
it's all okay, right? And you
Yes.
need that, like you really need that.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
man, you need that bad.
Well, because what we're talking about is literally putting the weight of the world, the universe, on your shoulders. And if you think you actually are the thing underneath it, it'll crush you. And it did
Yes.
to me. That's part of why my back hurts so much. But there's also a way of, when you feel like you as God, when you feel like God, it through you, is a better way of saying it. God through you is cleansing the universe of sin, of all the badness that, that this is the way of becoming a hero that doesn't speak to the ego. That's a trap. But anyway, the hero of awareness, the becoming of God, the bravery of that. And in retrospect, like what people run from is that responsibility.
Mhm.
But if you can take that on as something that you feel worthy to do so, and you feel, it's not a martyr thing. It's not like, oh, look at me, I'm the one doing this for you. Like that's the total opposite of this. What I'm talking
No,
about is,
it's it's the agape toward
yes,
yourself.
yes, yeah,
It's the ability to take the totality of your experience and just allow it to be in the just totally,
yes,
oh, like it's okay, and you can be. That is the only way that you can bear the responsibility of
yes.
being in that space.
And what we're talking about at the unconscious level, because awareness actually knows it's God the whole time, and ego is just trying to pretend it doesn't know. So at that level, it's taking on that ultimate responsibility on behalf at the unity level, at the God level of the consciousness, the truest truth, what you really are and what you've really done, and how you've interpreted that. And it's almost like a shearing effect, the difference between how your identity views that as a person or partial person still, and how God views it. And that's what that like what my ego is a fragile thing that likes to be a man, and like all these things, like it just couldn't possibly bear the responsibility for having operated the universe the way that it has. And well, not my ego, I'm sorry, the way that God has. And like it's like dropping a billion-pound weight on a person, you know
Yeah,
what I mean? Like
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. This
And
is why
again,
it
it's
can
just
only,
about where you place yourself in relation to that weight. But
yeah. Well, and this is why, like, this is why the insistence on perfection from the ascetics, right? And this is
yes.
why the ascetics are always, I've been reading Saint Simeon, the new theologian, who was one of the formative Christian mystics and an ascetic monk, and going through their just unbelievably radical requirements on the abdication and really chastisement of any kind of physical um, appetite or anything, right? To
Mm-hmm.
to to get it all so quiet, all of it so quiet, because that was the only way they understood how to move, to create enough space in their processors to be able to have a vision of God.
Yes.
right?
There's the decluttering of their personal frame.
Yeah, yeah. But it's still right. Like one of the things about all of this is again, because we are in this space time, that was a level of movement in the spiritual direction, right? And it was a level that we had to explore because it is a rung on the ladder. It is a rung on the ladder to move out those spaces and go through the lake of fire in such a way that you have to abandon everything else in your life such that you are in the lake of fire all the time,
Yes.
right? Like that's what that is.
Yeah.
But of course, like ultimately that's not the goal, because then why would all of this be here if that was the goal,
Mhm.
right? Like this
You're
is
trying
this
to
is
go through hell and come out the other side, not stay there.
yeah, yeah. And like if whatever, however the grace of God thing works and how the agency works there and what all that, like I don't know, man. I do not
Mm.
know how all that works. But it's clearly the case that in a moment in time that can occur, or it can never occur for you, right? And it
Mhm.
can occur on really deep levels. All of a sudden, just boom,
Yeah.
um, without going through those kinds of like ascetic
Oh,
practices.
absolutely. I think this is actually a good chance for us to talk about the intellectualization of this process, because I would hate for people to get the impression that the only way to get to these spaces is to think academically or to use words. I mean, the only reason we've spent this much time on our ability to do so is to teach. And so if you want to teach, you've got to kind of do that. But on a personal level, it doesn't have to be intellectual like at all.
Yeah.
I know people that the reason they love sports is because they have an experience of ecstasy,
Mhm.
of just the flow state. It's a very different type of connection, but it's very related at the same time. And there are, you know, every possible way of entering these spaces, and it's not at all, language is not the way to these spaces. We can kind of create a map here, but that's, I don't want to, you know, confuse that point.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a very important one. Um, Speaking from the space of not necessarily just you and I engaging here, but to to our lives beyond this and the interactions with other people. It is
Mm.
profoundly important that in order for any of this to be true, it must be true that it extends to the smallest child
Yes.
and the lowest intellect.
Mhm.
Um, it's not, you know, I'm not sure what we are exactly, right? But it's something like um, fragments that are operating in such a way of trying to generate connections between um, structures that have been laid down over millennia.
Mhm. We're
And
very focused on transferring it, which is
yeah,
a completely separate thing from reveling in it,
yeah,
on a personal level. And the reveling is actually made harder by by having an active language processor, right? So yeah, I want to separate those things because there is a simplicity that language can't capture. Language, when you try and capture it, you get into all this craziness that we're doing here. But on the simplest level, it is something you can just notice instantly. It's almost like a spatial, just a way of looking that's a little different. It's just around the frame of what we've been doing before. And I think re-emphasizing how simple it is becoming more important to me, because I'm realizing I'm getting excited. I love the models that we're making, and it's connecting so many things. And
yeah,
I'm trying to share it with people. And I almost sense at times it can be disheartening because they feel like there is a truth there, but it's not accessible to them.
yeah,
And I that's not the case. It is accessible, and there's a ton of different ways of approaching it.
yeah,
We're just trying to explain in language a way of understanding those approaches.
yeah. And mostly what we're doing is taking every model that we've ever been given and try to integrate it.
Yeah, which is a pretty good way of finding unity, right? Because
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. But we just do
you
it
look for you take all the fractals you have and you look for the patterning of the pattern within all of them, and that's how you get.
Yeah.
That's how you fill in the Sudoku puzzle.
Yeah. But that's, I mean, it can all be summed up in, the experiences sitting in a field, smelling a flower with the sun on your face, and you don't actually have a single thought in your mind.
You're
That's the
just
whole
losing
thing.
yourself in the moment. That's the whole thing. Yeah.
That's it. That's like,
And the ability to intentionally do that, but yeah.
That's probably, that's a way you could access it right now. But the cool part is that exact beingness, that exact isness that happens in that moment can be present in the lowest hell that you'll ever experience as well.
Yes. It is, and it's just, are you present with it?
Yeah.
In a sense, right? Like it's if you're subject and objecting, then you're not. But if
Yeah. Well, Steve, I suppose we ought to wrap up at some point.
Fair enough. Although it's hard to let go of this conversation. It's been beautiful.